French President Emmanuel Macron is in China. He's an embattled leader who's left his own country burning to apparently find peace for another. Paris has been burning, but Macron is hoping to help secure Kiev. Cities across France saw violent clashes in the past few days. Millions protested against the president's pension reform. So what is he doing in China? Perhaps looking for a win that he won't get at home. A win that may strengthen his claims to global leadership. And Beijing rolled out the red carpet for him. Xi Jinping gave Emmanuel Macron a ceremonial welcome. He hasn't come alone. Europe's top leader Ursula von der Leyen is also in China. But there's no grand reception for her. China has reserved the top honors for the French leader. And he's returning the favor with statements like these. Macron says Europe should not decouple from China.
Donc il ne faut pas de naïveté, c'est ce que notre Union européenne, je l'en félicite.
We must not be naive. Our European Union, taking the step of European sovereignty that I defended 5 years ago, is establishing trade defense instruments that are necessary for our credibility. But the EU must also be voluntarily committed to continuing to have a trade relationship with China.
Et donc il nous faut en quelque sorte
De-risk and not decouple. That's the message from Emmanuel Macron. EU chief Ursula von der Leyen used the same words a few days ago. And yet the import was quite different. Von der Leyen seems deeply skeptical of China.
How China meets international obligation regarding human rights will be another test for how and how much we can cooperate with China. Just as China has been ramping up its military posture, it has also ramped up its policies of disinformation and economic and trade coercion.
That should explain why the red carpet was reserved for just Emmanuel Macron. Either von der Leyen wants to play the bad cop, or she has clear differences with the French leader. This visit was supposed to project European unity, and they're trying their best, at least in front of the cameras. The European leaders are sticking to the message. They're engaging with Xi Jinping together, but Beijing is paying more attention to Emmanuel Macron. Because after Angela Merkel, Macron has been seen as Europe's de facto leader, and perhaps China hopes that when the time comes, he will be able to sway Europe. On his part, the French president is going all out. He wants to use this visit to bolster ties with China, and he's come with some 60 business leaders from France, a business delegation of 60. They're eyeing big-ticket deals. So business is very much on the agenda. And of course, they spoke about the war in Ukraine. The French president thinks that China can play a big role in ending hostilities.
The war led by Russia in Ukraine has profoundly affected the international order that we have known since 1945. And this war, which I have repeatedly described as imperialist and colonial, has violated many of the principles of the United Nations Charter, which we, two permanent members of the Security Council, must resolutely defend. So China, precisely because of its close relationship with Russia, which has been reaffirmed in recent days, can play a major role.
Reports say Macron has seen China's peace plan for Ukraine, and on some fronts he agrees with Beijing. Today he asked Xi Jinping to reason with Russia. The Chinese president has called for peace talks.
I know you are attached to respect for the United Nations Charter, to strict compliance with the text applying to the nuclear field, and therefore to everything that allows peace and stability on the planet. And in this respect, the Russian aggression in Ukraine has struck a blow against this stability. It has put an end to decades of peace in Europe, and I know that I can count on you, under the two principles that I have just mentioned, to bring Russia to its senses and everyone to the negotiating table.
Resume peace talks as soon as possible, in accordance with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, take into account the legitimate security concerns of all parties, seek political resolutions, and build a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security framework.
Connect the dots, and this is what you'll see. Emmanuel Macron is appeasing Xi Jinping. It's a strategy that he's tried before, only to end up with egg on his face. You see, every now and then, Macron tries to insert himself in global conflicts. He tries to play mediator between two warring factions. And does he succeed? Let's look at the track record. During the Trump years, Macron tried to save the Iran nuclear deal. It didn't work. In 2018, he went on a rescue mission to Washington. There were handshakes and chemistry, but there was no changing Trump's mind. He tore up the Iran nuclear pact. Then in 2022, last year, Macron tried to negotiate with Vladimir Putin. This was before Russia invaded Ukraine. The French president had a flurry of phone calls with Putin. He also traveled to Moscow. You may remember this picture. There were no handshakes this time. At the Kremlin, Putin gave Macron the long table treatment. He was made to sit 10 feet away from Putin. Needless to say, he returned to Paris empty-handed. And now he's trying to play peacemaker again. But this approach could not have been more flawed. He's hoping to strike peace with a leader whose core policy is expansionism. This engagement is a double-edged sword, and Macron, who's on the back foot at home, may also end up losing support in the region. The only person it benefits is Xi Jinping. The US and its military allies are turning their focus towards the Indo Pacific. I'm talking about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance between America and Europe. It started with about 12 members. Their main adversary was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union disintegrated some 30 years back, but NATO kept expanding. Today, it touches Russia's border and it has 31 members. We'll talk about the newest member, Finland. In fact, we have an exclusive interview coming up with Finland's foreign minister. But first, let's cover the Indo-Pacific. For years, the world has dreaded a NATO versus Russia war. It's happening as we speak. Now, should we also brace for a NATO versus China war? Because NATO has specific ambitions and it's spelling them out. It had a meeting on Tuesday. Foreign ministers of all NATO member states were present. Some non-NATO allies were also there, like Japan, New Zealand, and Australia. Also, the Deputy Foreign Minister of South Korea. And what's common among these four countries? None of them is a NATO member. All of them are in the Indo-Pacific, and they've all agreed to engage more with the NATO.
What happens in your region, what happens in the Indo-Pacific matters for Europe, and what happens in Europe matters for you. And I think the war in Ukraine demonstrates this very clearly with its global ramifications. And the fact that we also see that China and Russia are standing closer together makes it just even more important that we are standing together as partners, NATO allies, and you as four highly valued partners.
This is what NATO Secretary General said at the meeting. Highly valued partners, that's what NATO calls Japan, New Zealand, Australia, and South Korea. And Japan, for one, has committed to boosting cooperation with NATO. It said it cannot achieve the goal of a free and open Indo-Pacific on its own. So it needs NATO. And NATO is sending feelers to another country in the Indo-Pacific, a country that has exchanged physical blows with China, a country whose military is actually looking China in the eye and challenging China's belligerence every step of the way. I'm talking about India. Last week, the US ambassador to NATO said this, and I'm quoting, "NATO's door is open to more cooperation if India seeks that. NATO is more than happy to sit down anytime with India." And NATO is sitting down with India. Just last month, a NATO team was in India for what's being called a secret meeting, the first of its kind between NATO and Indian officials on Indian soil. And do you know what was discussed? The situation in the Indo-Pacific and a roadmap of cooperation between India and NATO. Now, just in case it wasn't clear, when NATO says it wants to play a bigger role in the Indo-Pacific, it basically means it wants to do more to challenge China. And obviously, it cannot challenge China on its own. It needs partners in the region. And that's what it's trying to find in countries like India, partners in the fight against China. Last year, NATO recognized China as a systemic challenge. And it has been trying to get its skin in the Indo-Pacific game ever since. This does not mean that countries in the region, countries like India, will become NATO members. India is not pursuing that just yet. It means they'll work together if it comes to that, like NATO is doing with Ukraine. When Russia invaded, NATO rushed to Ukraine's defense. Weapon systems, ammunition, a lot of money and moral support. NATO is giving all of it to Ukraine. This is a de facto Russia versus NATO war, and it has inspired more countries to join the NATO security umbrella. The newest member is Finland. It joined the alliance on Tuesday. This is a country that remained neutral for decades. It did not take sides even at the height of the Cold War, but now it has. And joining us is the Foreign Minister of Finland, Mr. Pekka Haavisto. He's with us from Amsterdam, and this is a Firstpost exclusive. Mr. Pekka Haavisto, welcome to Firstpost, and congratulations on your success in joining the NATO. What does it mean for Finland?
Thank you. For us, it means a lot because we Finns are very security-oriented people, and since last February, when Russia attacked Ukraine, we have been witnessing war in Europe. And at this moment, of course, we feel that we are not defending ourselves only alone, but we have the support of the 30 other NATO countries helping us if anything goes to wrong direction.
Finland and Sweden applied for membership together. Turkey was the hurdle. You crossed it. Sweden could not cross it. How did you pull it off? And what concessions did Finland make? Was there a backroom deal?
Well, there was not a background deal. We, of course, established last summer in Madrid, in a NATO summit, a working group or tripartite working group between Sweden, Finland and Turkey. We went through some of those concerns of Turkey, including terrorism. The PKK is a terrorist organization that is forbidden both in, not only in Turkey, but also in Finland and Sweden. We discussed about the Gülenists, we discussed about the Syrian YPG and other Kurdish groups. And we, of course, found out that we have different legislation in our countries compared with Turkey. But it's important that in Finland there were no provocations against Turkey during these negotiations and so forth. And we know that Sweden is changing something in their terrorist legislation happening first days of June. And this hopefully helps also now Sweden to join NATO. Of course, our accession is not complete until Sweden is also a member, because we have a very close military cooperation with Sweden traditionally.
Nuclear weapons are a core component of NATO's deterrence, but Finland has always called nuclear weapons illegal. You have a strong record of non-proliferation. Is that position going to change now? Will Finland bring nuclear weapons on its soil? And will it come up with a new policy on nuclear weapons?
Well, currently we have a legislation that prevents nuclear material or nuclear weapons to be transferred to Finnish soil, and there has not been discussion of changing that legislation. My understanding is that actually those nuclear weapons that NATO has or are controlled by NATO is permanently located to certain places in Europe, and I haven't heard any particular decisions or plans to change those locations.
Is Finland looking to change its policy?
Well, we haven't changed anything in our policy, of course. When joining NATO, you accept that part of the deterrence is also that NATO has nuclear weapons, or NATO countries have nuclear weapons, but also the NATO policy is that it would be better to have a nuclear-free world, but so that every country quits nuclear weapons.
So now Finland is fundamentally okay with the idea of nuclear weapons?
Currently, we understand that NATO as an organization and NATO countries have also the nuclear deterrence.
I understand NATO has been in talks with India. There have been reports of closed-door meetings. Do you see a shift on India's part, a willingness to do more with NATO? As a member of NATO, do you also think that India should engage more actively with this alliance?
Well, one of the topics that we discussed in a NATO foreign ministers meeting was, of course, the Indo Pacific issues, discussed about China, discussed about the Taiwan issue, and in many speeches also the role of India actually as a close partner to European Union and to many NATO countries was mentioned. And of course, also Finland during the recent years have established quite close cooperation with India. Minister Jaishankar has been visiting Finland as well, and we have a good communication with India.
What role do you see for the NATO in the Indo Pacific?
Well, of course, one role for NATO countries is to keep the Taiwan Straits open for commercial traffic and maintain the freedom of maritime movement and so forth. I think that's one of the key issues. And of course, we see different risks also of conflict escalating in the Indo Pacific area, but of course NATO's role is to defend NATO territories and territories of NATO countries.
Mr. Pekka Haavisto, thank you very much for joining us here on First Post, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thanks. Good talking to you.
Meanwhile, in Ukraine, President Zelensky has a new demand. He wants more military jets. He's talking about a warplane coalition. In the battlefield, he's on the back foot. Ukraine is struggling to hold back Russian forces in the east. Reports say Bakhmut is slipping. It's a strategic city and Ukraine is not being able to keep it. But Zelensky insists they've not lost. At the same time, he made a telling admission. He said Ukraine could be forced to withdraw if casualties pile up. They're calling it strategic withdrawal. It's a withdrawal all the same. Zelensky spoke about it in Poland. He was there yesterday to shore up support. Poland is a critical ally of Ukraine. And here's what Zelensky said.
We just need not stop in solidarity. When the battle requires artillery, it should be provided. When victory requires tanks, their roar should be heard on the front line. When independence requires air forces, we should not pay attention to how Russia will react to aircraft in our country. We shouldn't think about which number looks safer next to the letter F-16 or some other. It is worth acting. Acting in the same way as your leadership has proved itself in the tank coalition, and I believe it will also prove itself in the aviation coalition, because this is a battle for freedom, and it is impossible to win it partially.
Remember, Poland was instrumental in getting Western tanks into Ukraine. Now Zelensky wants it to lead a warplane coalition. Warsaw has already sent 4 jets to Ukraine and Poland's president has promised more.
4 MiGi były 29 z naszych zasobów, których jeszcze
4 MiG-29s that remained in storage have been handed over to the Ukrainian armed forces in recent months. 4 MiGs are now being given, so 8 in total. We are ready, as I told the President, to give 6 more that are currently being prepared. We assume they could be transferred soon.
Notice that he didn't mention F-anythings. Ukraine has been getting Soviet-era MiG fighter jets from its allies, but it hasn't received any American jets yet. And Zelensky is obviously not happy about it. Also because he's losing Bakhmut. This city, Bakhmut, is the center of the war's longest and bloodiest battle yet. For months, Russia has been trying to capture this eastern city. Moscow says it is strategically located for further offensives. Kiev and its allies say it's not that important. But they don't want to hand Russia even a symbolic victory. That's what they're saying. Russia recently said it had captured Bakhmut. But Ukraine denied it. It said the announcement was Russian propaganda. Like in any war, both sides are using psychological warfare to misrepresent ground realities. It's difficult to say who is speaking the truth. It's difficult to verify what the actual situation is. But Zelensky's latest speech hints that Ukraine could lose Bakhmut soon.
For me, the most important is not to lose our soldiers, and of course, if there is a moment of even hotter events and the danger we could lose our personnel because of encirclement, of course the corresponding correct decisions will be taken by generals there. I am sure about that. However, the more relevant ammunition comes to Ukraine, the faster we will be able to overcome the situation, not only in Bakhmut, but throughout the territory of our country.
He spoke of encirclement and correct decisions by the generals. That doesn't sound like Ukraine will last long there, if they haven't been routed already, that is. So Kiev is once again reaching out to its allies to help turn the tide. Without its Western allies, Ukraine could very well capitulate. And of course, Russia knows all of this. Moscow has slammed what it calls NATO's proxy war against Russia. President Vladimir Putin continues to blame the West in general and the US in particular for everything that has unfolded. This is what he said to a US ambassador during a ceremony in the Kremlin yesterday.
Relations between Russia and the United States, on which global security and stability directly depend, are experiencing a deep crisis, unfortunately. It is based on fundamentally different approaches to the formation of the modern world order. Dear Madam Ambassador, I don't want to break the serenity of the diplomatic credentials receiving ceremony, And I know you may not agree, but I cannot but note that the United States uses in their foreign policy tools, such as their support for the so-called color revolutions, support in this regard for the coup in Kiev in 2014, ultimately led to today's crisis in Ukraine and additionally made a negative contribution to the degradation of Russian-American relations.
He's talking about a revolution some 10 years ago. It led to the ouster of Ukraine's president, Viktor Yanukovych. Yanukovych was pro-Russia. He had to leave office. The US is said to have supported that protest. And Russia used this as an excuse to target Ukraine. It invaded Crimea back in 2014. Now, the US does have a long history of trying to force regime change, but so does Russia. It has been accused of interfering in the domestic affairs of foreign nations. There's obviously Ukraine. Moldova, too, recently accused Russia of trying to foment dissent. So meddling is not behavior that's unique to the US, and nor is it likely to stop. And as usual, we in the rest of the world will continue to face the fallout of these great power games.